The miraculous victory of Gideon when facing great challenges. Many of us feel powerless and confused. Have you ever felt too small to do anything against challenges that seem impossible to overcome? You might be facing battles not with enemies on the battlefield, but with struggles in life, like broken relationships, stagnant work, or even health issues and financial struggles. In such times, we might feel left behind, as though we lack behind, strength to face the world around us. But when we look at the story of Gideon in the Bible, you will see that some victories are beyond imagination. Imagine you were Gideon, a regular soldier in the nation of Israel, living in a time when everyone was oppressed under the brutal rule of the Midianites. Israel had been invaded, crops destroyed, and people had to live in fear, hiding in caves. A regular person like Gideon had no special qualities to become a military leader. Something changed his life. The appearance of an angel. This angel called Gideon, a mighty warrior. Even though he had no military experience and was living in fear, the time when Gideon lived was a period full of chaos. Nation of Israel. The Bible tells us that the Israelites had done evil in the sight of the Lord and were handed over to the Midianites. These enemies invaded Israel like a swarm of locusts, destroying crops and stealing livestock. The Israelites became dark and full of suffering. They could no longer live in freedom, and the villages and cities they had built became targets of invaders, once prosperous. The Israelites now had to hide in caves, fearing they would lose everything. In this context, we meet Gideon, a regular young man, threshing wheat in a winepress to hide it from the Midianites. It's hard to believe that someone living in fear could become a powerful military leader. But the appearance of an angel changed everything. God spoke to Gideon, "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." Gideon couldn't believe it, as he felt unworthy. If the Lord is with us, why has all this happened to us? He wondered, much like many of us when facing hardships. This question reflects a deep doubt about God's presence in our lives, especially when we're struggling with great challenges. Although Gideon doubted, God did not reprimand him, but pointed out an important truth. Go in the strength you have and save Israel from the Midianites. This was not about Gideon's strength, but about God's power. This call wasn't about demanding perfection or a mighty army. It was an invitation to walk by faith, trusting in God's help, even though Gideon might have felt unprepared. Even though Gideon received the call from God, he still couldn't shake off his doubts. He asked for a clear sign to confirm that this calling was truly from God. Gideon prepared an offering of goat meat and unleavened bread and placed it on a rock. God responded with a miraculous sign. Fire sprang up from the rock, consuming the offering and proving God's presence. This moment made Gideon realize that he was truly face to face with God, and his faith began to change. This action of God was not only a miraculous display of his power, but also a lesson about faith. God showed Gideon that, even though he felt small and powerless, by submitting and trusting in God, he would be equipped to carry out his will. Despite the powerful sign from God, Gideon still felt uneasy and wanted further confirmation. He asked for another sign, this time using a fleece of wool, to make the fleece wet while the ground remained dry. The next time, he asked for the fleece to remain dry while the ground was wet. These repeated requests show Gideon's hesitation and how God patiently answered each of his requests to strengthen his faith. Gideon's journey is one of transformation, from a person full of doubt and fear to one of decisive leadership. This is a journey that many of us can relate to when facing uncertainty in life. We too go through a process of learning to trust and obey what we believe is right, even though it might not be easy. As God continued to give Gideon signs, he began to trust more in his role in God's plan. From someone hiding in the shadows, Gideon transformed into a courageous warrior, not because he believed in his own strength, but because he knew that God was with him. This change in Gideon was not just about the strength of one person, but the strength that comes from trusting in a greater power, God. Here's a key moment in the story. When Gideon had gathered a large army, God instructed him to reduce the army from 32,000 soldiers to just 300. This seemed like an odd strategy, but it carries a deep lesson. God didn't want the victory to come from military strength or numbers, but from faith and obedience. When we look at this story, we see that God wants us to realize that true victories do not come from our own strength, but from His help and guidance. God made Gideon and his army face a battle where they couldn't rely on numbers or weapons. To win, they had to fully depend on God. God's command was for Gideon to select 300 men from the reduced army. This selection process, the soldiers had to drink water, and those who lapped it like dogs were chosen. This test, guided by God, was to find men with particular qualities: alertness, quickness, and good judgment, who would not only fight but also remain vigilant in the face of the enemy. This teaches us the importance of being prepared and vigilant for life's great battles. This vigilance doesn't just come from paying attention to our surroundings, but from how we face the crucial decisions in life. When the battle began, we see that Gideon's strategy was something few could have imagined. He divided his 300 men into small groups, each armed with a trumpet, a torch, and a jar. At midnight, they would blow their trumpets and break their jars to create a loud sound. It seemed like a large army was attacking unexpectedly. This wasn't just a military strategy, but a psychological tactic that worked extremely well. God wanted Gideon to demonstrate that victory wasn't about having a large army, but trusting in His guidance. The power of this strategy was not only in confusing the enemy, but in creating the illusion of a large force attacking from every direction. In this way, the Midianites believed they were being attacked by a massive force, and in panic they began fighting each other. This reminds us that in life, when we trust God's plan, He can use strategies we could never think of to bring about victory. Victory doesn't always come from the ways we expect, but often from paths we cannot immediately see. Gideon's victory is proof of God's presence in the most difficult battles. When 300 of Gideon's men executed this strategy, the Midianites not only panicked but began to fight among themselves. They didn't have to fight directly, but just broke their jars and blew their trumpets, creating noise and light, as though they were an enormous army. When we look at this victory, what we see is that it wasn't military strength or complex tactics brought the victory, but trusting in God. The Midianites, after falling into chaos, began attacking each other. They lost control of the situation, and the Israelites only needed to watch from afar as their victory unfolded. Notably, Israelites didn't suffer significant losses in this battle. All of this was thanks to the miraculous strategy and guidance from God. The lesson here is, when God leads, we can rest assured that He will protect us and provide opportunities to overcome challenges without us having to pay a great price. This is a lesson about depending on God rather than relying on our. God can use the small things to accomplish great miracles, just as He did through Gideon's 300 soldiers. Although victory had been achieved, Gideon's story didn't end there. After their great triumph, Israel faced other challenges, not from their enemies, but from internal divisions and disagreements within the nation. Even as victory was at hand, opposition from tribes like Ephraim arose, feeling they hadn't been respected enough in the battle. Gideon, with his wisdom and patience, skillfully addressed the situation, calming the anger of Ephraim and maintaining unity within the nation. In life, we also learn that not only external battles are important, but internal challenges are just as significant. Sometimes, division and competition within can weaken us, but if we hold on to patience and wisdom, we can overcome these challenges as well. Ultimately, Gideon led the Israelites in pursuit of the remaining enemies, securing complete victory, however. This victory also brought Gideon to face difficult decisions. When the people of Israel suggested that he become their king, Gideon refused, asserting that only God should be the true king of Israel. Although this decision was right, after his death, Israel reverted to worshiping Baal, showing that great victories can fade if faith and obedience Aaron maintained. Even though there was a grand victory, Gideon's story continued to reveal new challenges, not from enemies outside, but from divisions within Israel. One of the biggest challenges Gideon faced was opposition from the tribes of Israel. Despite their massive victory, not everyone was satisfied with Gideon's leadership. The leaders of the tribe of Ephraim, one of the most important tribes in Israel, felt they had not been sufficiently honored by not being called to participate in a decisive battle. They demanded Gideon explain why they weren't called to join the attack against the Midianites. This reflects greed and pride, emotions that many of us can relate to when we feel we haven't received the recognition we deserve. It reminds us that in time of victory, we must also face internal challenges, not just external enemies, but also disagreements and pride within our community. Gideon, with his wisdom, didn't let this dissatisfaction tear apart the unity of Israel. He cleverly responded that the victory was not his alone but belonged to everyone, and he acknowledged the significant contribution of Ephraim in killing the two Midianite leaders. Through this response, Gideon was able to calm the anger of Ephraim and preserve the unity within Israel. After the great victory, Gideon became a hero in the eyes of the Israelites. The people, who had lived in fear for many years, now saw Gideon as a great leader, worthy of a great leader, becoming their king. They suggested that Gideon take the throne, but he refused, affirming that only God should be the true king of Israel. This was a bold and faithful decision. Gideon understood that Israel's victory was not due to his military strength, but because of God's guidance and power. Therefore, he did not want to abuse his personal power. However, although Gideon refused to become king, his actions later created complications in his life. After the victory, Gideon asked every Israelite to give a gold earring from the spoils of war. Wow. His intention might have simply been to create a memento of the victory. The result was that the Israelites began worshiping the ephod, a ceremonial garment made from the ephod spoils, leading them to return to the worship of Baal, which was a betrayal of their faith in God.